All right. Any discussion of and in New Jersey cannot begin without consideration of land and labor. Land and labor acknowledgements are tangible political admissions of the ongoing violence of the settler colonial state and our own implicit participation in it. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. Anaya?
Thanks, Maria. We read this land acknowledgement, which is offered by the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation for those who seek to honor the Lenape people and their territory preceding an event in Lenapehoking, also known as New Jersey. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape Chief Tamanin, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the migrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine.
And we read this labor acknowledgement offered by Dr. T.J. Stewart, who's the Assistant Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at Iowa State University. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the horror of transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice. And we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. For us at Gathering Ground, we read these statements to make visible what has been invisible to many people, particularly people racialized as white. We acknowledge these historical truths of the theft of people and land, enslavement, forced migration, and forced labor. And though this is our history, it must not be our future. We at Gathering Ground are committed to working in community and constant dialogue with all of you and disrupting this fatalistic view and create new norms and new structures for a more equitable world. Yeah, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Casey. Okay, and before we turn it over to our guest speaker today, I just want to tell you a little bit about Gathering Ground. We are a multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational, and socioeconomically diverse movement of people committed to taking action that creates thriving and equitable communities. We offer a variety of programs to address systemic issues and empower individuals to become agents of positive change. From our community engagement initiatives to our collaborative learning experiences, each program, like today's briefing, is developed and crafted with the needs of our community in mind and with the goal of cultivating a culture of equity and justice. We encourage you to check our programming calendar for our upcoming workshops and events. We're kicking off our Elevating Equity programming next week, and we're partnering with Whitney Parnell of Service Never Sleeps for our 6-part race equity training. We hope you join us April 1 and 2 from 9:30 to 1. Check out our website for more information. And later this month, on April 24th, we'll have another briefing on artificial intelligence, embracing AI for nonprofit impact with our guest, Rachel Kimber. So I'm hoping my team is putting stuff in the chat and you can check those out. We hope you consider joining us for these programs. Space is limited, so we ask that you register. And again, registration is free. Okay, I want to recognize the people who've been working on today's briefing. The team at Gathering Ground, Casey O'Brien, our Director of Programming, Anaya Brown, our Communications Associate, here with us today, and Alyssa Prevost, our Operations Associate, who is not here with us today. We also want to thank those who made possible that, this work is made possible with the support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, the Grunin Foundation, and PSE&G. I thank all of you for being here with us today and for making this a priority in your busy schedules. Okay, in true Gathering Ground style, this will be a conversation. The Gathering Ground team will help facilitate. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or drop the question in the chat. And remember, if you want your question to be anonymous, you can message Casey and Anaya, and we'll ask the question on your behalf. I want to say a few words about Bob Hennelly before I turn it over to him. Bob Hennelly is an award-winning print and broadcast journalist. For more than 30 years, he has reported on a broad spectrum of major public policy questions, ranging from homeland security to the economy, environmental contamination to corruption, and occupational safety to homelessness. Born in Paterson, New Jersey, he has always had a keen interest in the roles of immigration, local politics, business, labor unions, real estate ownership, and environmental protection in the evolution of the United States. Bob is the interim general manager at WBAI and the executive producer of We Decide, America at the Crossroads with Jenna Flanagan, a national program produced by the Pacifica Radio Network. He hosts a weekly radio talk show, What's Going On, Labor Monday on WBAI, focusing on politics and labor. He had been on air as a senior investigative reporter for WNYC New York Public Radio for more than 12 years, covering politics, government, and the civil service. Before WNYC, he was a national affairs correspondent for Pacifica Network News. After WNYC, he continued to be an on-air investigative reporter with WBGO Newark Public Radio, as well as a frequent guest on Sirius and New Hampshire Public Radio. His investigative work focusing on national labor issues and public policy, occupational safety and health, the New York City politics and civil service, and all the things New Jersey has been published for many years in several print and online journals, including Salon.com, The Chief Leader, Inside New Jersey, City and State, and Work Bites. Bob has covered the global economy from CBS Money Watch, and in the 1990s was on staff at the Village Voice. Over the past 3 decades, Bob has also been a freelance reporter for CBS 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Detroit Free Press, the Miami Herald, the Christian Science Monitor, the Bergen Record, and the Guardian. In addition to his work in journalism, Bob has worked for the American Ballet Theater Foundation as a consultant for DC 37 AFSCME, one of New York's largest municipal unions, as well as serving as the chief of staff for a New Jersey state senator. Bob lives at the New Jersey shore with his wife, Debbie, and their 2 rescue dogs. They are the proud parents of 3 fabulous daughters and new grandparents. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
You can see
Thank you so
from
much.
his extensive experience working on labor why we asked Bob to join us today for today's briefing. So I will turn it over to you, Bob.
Thanks so much. We're going to spend just a few moments of, and I do so appreciate having those acknowledgments, because in this particular point in time in American history, when I do believe that we are operating under what I refer to on air as the Trump mos conta, it's important to understand that we not despair, because it is true that this nation was founded on genocide and its foundation was laid with slavery. And so I prefer to see us as this, it's this tidal pull, right? We have this aspiration of democracy. It's articulated as something we hope for. And we've set up our government with the notion that we can get there. And yet in our lifetime, we've experienced significant setbacks where the women on this call have fewer rights today than they did just a few years ago. So while we've accepted in the textbook the notion of the advancement of the human condition through what we're doing here in the United States, the lived experience is quite the opposite with the loss of reproductive rights. So our conversation has to be informed by a certain sense of where we really are, not where we'd like to be, and so I pick labor because to me that's the one thing that brings us all together. And in a period of time where the government and the structure of the federal government seems to be every day about taking us apart and undoing basically the social contract that came as a consensus out of the Great Depression and the World War II era, it's important to reflect on the role of labor in creating the social safety net that we have taken for granted. But now we are tasked with the challenge, the generational challenge, to fight for every bit of it. And so it's important to talk about the contours of what labor was and what it is now. And so I would say that, say, coming out of the Second World War, you're talking about a third of American households being in a labor union movement or being affiliated with a union. We know that just before Ronald Reagan, who himself ironically was president of the Screen Actors Guild, as president, basically kneecapped the labor movement by laying off summarily some 11,000 air traffic controllers who in 1981 raised the concern that the United States was not properly investing in them or in the infrastructure that supported commercial aviation. As the New York Times has subsequently reported, every one of those issues raised in 1981 for which they were fired are truer today, as we saw bore out in that tragedy just a couple of months ago, where all those promising young athletes and all the other unsuspecting travelers plunged to their death after a civilian airliner collided with a Black Hawk helicopter. Ironically, in a kind of dystopian way, in the coverage area of Ronald Reagan International Airport. And so, what we saw in that response by the chief executive is exactly what we need to focus on, which was not that he would reserve judgment and let the considerable civil service that works and has kept aviation flying, not to wait for them to weigh in, but for himself to use that tragedy as a way of dividing the nation by claiming it was part of diversity and inclusion, not the fact, as we've learned subsequently, that there was only one air traffic controller when there should have been two. And so after Reagan did what he did by summarily dismissing air traffic controllers, we saw an almost immediate diminution in representation and density. When I use the phrase density, I'm referring to the percentage of individuals in a union. That dropped to around 10%. Today, in the private sector, it's an anemic 6%. And in the public sector, it's like in the 30% realm, but it averages out at around 10%, 10.1, 10.2% of the entire workforce population. Now, for local context, it's important to know that, and this will be a fun thing. Can anyone here tell me what state do you think has the highest? This is the interactive part, Maria. I didn't tell you we do that. What is the highest percentage state that has the highest union density? Any takers? Anybody want to take a gander?
We've
Let's
got
see.
a message in the chat that says California, and
Oh.
Antonia said New Jersey, question mark.
Okay, great,
New
great,
York,
great.
question mark.
This for me as a former adjunct, this is very gratifying. Hawaii, 25.6%. And so New York, and this gets people in New York upset, 21.5%. California, 16.9%. New Jersey, 17.3%. So that's that's the range of play. Now, it's important that only in 27 states do we have a double figure that is over 10% of workers in a union. In states like Louisiana, you're in the low single digits, right to work states, which interestingly enough dovetails with the Jim Crow states. So what we see here is a parallel construction between the white supremacist structure of civil society in the South and right to work laws. Now, what happened in the 80s and 90s, and even into the 2000s, was a loss of ground of the labor movement in general. Why did that happen? And it's important now, as we look to the labor movement, it's my belief that the labor movement is the only thing right now that can turn the tide on this junta. Not the Democratic Party. It is clearly not up to scale, nor does it really fundamentally understand the plight of working people. And it's lost touch with the actual circumstance of the people in the country. That's why we've had a classic situation where union leadership, with the exception of the Teamsters and the International Association of Firefighters, who sat out the race, all went for the Democrats. And we saw in too many states, key states, where either millions of individuals who were associated with labor stayed home or actually voted for Donald Trump. And so as we reconfigure the American landscape and talk about how can we regain that collective sense of moving forward, it's important to understand where are the blind spots. Where is it that collective organizing, and I will say that what we're seeing now is the current administration is focused on anything that is collective, its source of power is collective. The current administration is targeting to disassemble, because that's the nature of juntas, is that anything that is a source of power, moral authority, social cohesion, is a threat to the central power. And so in a nation that has an idea of this kind of broad diversity, that becomes a threat. The concept of, and that's why you saw one of the big developments that was underreported was the decision by Kristi Noem, head of DHS secretary, to eliminate the collective bargaining rights of all of the TSA members. That is some 50 to 60,000 Americans whose job it is to keep the airport safe and who just recently won collective bargaining rights. And so that is a workforce, and that's why Sarah Nelson, who I interviewed, who leads the the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, she called that Patco on steroids. Who makes up that workforce? 30% are veterans. A large percentage are people of color. Historically, and this is the white supremacist part of what's going on, the civil service and unions have been a place that have been a pathway of equity for people of color to build a life that is based on merit, service, and discipline. And so it is, what's happened is we're seeing a direct attack on all of those structures. It's instructive to go back and look at the pandemic. And what's kind of surprising is how this country went from this consciousness of the essential worker. All of a sudden, when there was a mass death event that claimed 1.1 million Americans, disabled millions more, there was a consciousness and awareness that there was this population of individuals upon which society relied on entirely. It was a transcendent moment in consciousness that it had anthropological implications that we still don't fully understand. As Reverend Barber points out, we did not pause and mourn this, nor have we even taken stock of the tremendous price paid by essential workers. And so it should come as no surprise that the about face of abusing essential workers it's a sin compounded by the fact that just 3 or 4 years ago, we were entirely dependent on these people that we want to dispose of now. And it does have a racial dimension. Every bit as clearly as you do that enunciation and benediction in the beginning, that is what is playing out today. Now, specifically in New Jersey, we had 300 nurses and healthcare professionals die in the first wave of the pandemic. Nationally, 3,600 perished. We know that from The Guardian and Kaiser Health News that meticulously went over all of these occupational records. And we know that in New York City, 500 civil servants of various job titles died in that first wave. 120 people who worked in the subways and buses, who were not permitted, in some cases in the beginning, to wear masks because it would scare the population. And unions, when they were told, the CDC at the time, because we had not made provisions, we were not listening to labor, the nurses were told to ignore their treatment, their training, that an N95 mask is to be disposed of after each clinical encounter. They were told to adopt it as a pet and to take it to work in their lunch pail for a week. And we reported on press conferences, the chief leader, where they predicted, the nurses predicted, the people, the workers on the front lines, that as a consequence of this country's lack of preparation, they would die, their families would become infected, and hospitals would become a vector for the disease we were fighting. All of that happened. Elmhurst Hospital, and all these names itch in our mind what happened in New York. The catastrophic loss of life was a consequence of a country that put historically, and still does, profits over patients. It had been doing it for years. And so at the table, unions had been talking about this issue. Anyone that was paying attention to public health knew that for years there was discussion and colloquy about a pandemic. And this country, coming out of the Obama era, disinvested in public health. And so now we're seeing, just now, doubling down, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. dismantling right now in real time the public health apparatus of the United States of America. Right now in real time, Office of Management and Budget stopping any global use of vaccines around the world to stop infectious disease. Right now. So that's why all of these conversations have to be different. And it's labor that is raising these issues, as they always have. Now, my personal story, and how can we turn the tide? And what can we do now? And why is it important that we rise to the occasion to preserve this social contract and at least keep alive the notion that we can be better than we were? And that's the other thing we have to do, is shift the conversation. About a few years ago, I guess when I left WNYC, I went to work at WBAI. Some of you may listen, you knew about it. At the time, when I went to work there after a long career at WNYC, it came to my attention that they were illegally using the airwaves to sell new age healthcare products in violation of their nonprofit status. My wife, who's an attorney, advised me, just write a letter to the executive director and surely everything will work out. I was fired the next day. Scroll forward 10 years later, and just, BA is made up of the Pacifica Foundation. It has 5 radio stations. The same person that fired me called me up and said, we'd like you to start a drive time labor program called What's Going On. And so I was working as the chief leader. My other outlets, Salon, they all liked this idea. I started a radio program 3 years ago, Labor Day. And it was basically a platform for unions to come forward and talk about what was going on. And more importantly, a discussion for union members who were disappointed about the lack of democracy in their own unions. Because remember, unions are human enterprises. They have racism. They have a problem with succession planning. They have a problem with people like me, white males who are hanging around and don't know when it's time to turn it over to somebody else. And so this became a successful, viable program. And then the general manager said, listen, I'm going to have 6 months into this run. He says, I'm going to have to preempt you for some more. They're going to sell some more snake oil. And I said, no. Here's $20,000 from 3 labor unions. And that was CWA of New Jersey, 32BJ, and 1199. We're going to do a sustaining sponsorship model, which is legit, basically informing them, that the public, that this is supported by labor, and no commercial, just an acknowledgement. And so I get a call from the new executive director who says, well, this is amazing. How did you get this money? Do we have to mail them anything? And I said, no, just make sure to get their name right and send them an IRS receipt that they gave the money. I ended up running that radio station, and that manager who fired me got fired. That radio station is only on today because my team and myself have raised close to $300,000 from unions representing 2 million households. We have been able to cover events like the protest 2 Saturdays ago in Lower Manhattan, where 10,000 people from unions and their families and supporters marched in opposition to the Trump Musk junta and the cuts to everything that is going on. People got to hear themselves in the street. They got a reflection of the agency that they had claimed. So all I can tell you is that this collective action works, and that we're at a turning point where we can make a difference. And I've been able to create an opportunity through working through collective action. And that's kind of where I am right now. So I don't know if that's a good break to have an
That's
exchange, but I
that's
wanted
great.
to share that with you.
Thank you so much, Bob. That's definitely helpful. Just looking at the chat here. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. All right. So we do have some questions for you, Bob, and I'm curious because of your extensive knowledge in the field, reporting and seeing firsthand what some of the struggles that unions have faced in this country, in particular in New Jersey. I'm wondering if you can share with us from your reporting, what are the biggest challenges facing workers and labor organizing in New Jersey today? And do you have any
So,
thoughts on how those challenges can be overcome?
so this is kind of, it's directly on point. And one of the things that I covered very closely, and some people may be familiar with the struggle, United Steelworkers Local Dash 4 Dash 200, 1,700 nurses at Robert Wood Johnson University Hospital went on strike related to safer staffing. One of the issues that had been going on for a long time was when this, even before COVID, nurses, it's not that there's a shortage of nurses. There are a million nurses sitting on the sidelines who don't want to experience the moral injury of not doing nursing the way they were trained, that puts patients first.
Mhm.
That's why they're on the sidelines. So these nurses at Robert Wood Johnson organized, voted to strike. And so this strike went from August to December 2023. And what happened was in Middlesex County, the politics were such that they didn't have the support of the Democratic political machine. And so they really had to build. So that's the other thing. What happens when, because they had the president of the college, the chairman of the board of that hospital was a major Democratic figure. Middlesex County politics was all tied into the huge amount of money that's in the hospital healthcare system. And so they had to create a community, build on the community relationship. And the crowds, they got 400 people coming out to support them, right? Because they were on strike for safer staffing. One of the things that happened, and this is where the story goes back into my story about the radio station. I made a commitment to them that every Monday they could come on so that they would have a place and a platform to discuss what they were experiencing. Because when you go on strike, it upends your life. This is a heroic act of it's social conscience. It's Gandhi-esque. It means you deprive your family of your income, and in the case of the nurses, their health care was stripped away. And so imagine you've taken the risk of communicable diseases, and then the hospital, where they were paying, I guess the CEO of Robert Wood Johnson was getting like $16 million in the second year of the pandemic. Um, they're up against that. They spent $180 million in replacement nurses. By coming on the radio every Monday, there was solidarity. There was a conversation between themselves and other nurses and around the country. Then, when the judge ordered that they reduce their crowd size to only 10, we had a radio rally. We got Reverend Barbara on and Sarah Nelson, and nurses called from all over the country. And so that's an example of, you're given a difficult landscape, you
Right.
don't have political friends, then you reach out and you broaden the community, you make it bigger than your opposition.
Mhm.
They won their strike.
That's great. I mean, this perfect transition to, given what you just said about what seemed to work for those nurses, what do you think are three ingredients to successful organizing? Sounds like you said the importance of solidarity, finding people to support you, right? What else would
So
you say?
I would say that it has to be this really one word, authenticity. I mean, you have to have it's an interesting tai chi of leadership and service. So you as a leader or as someone who's organizing, you have to have an ear. What are they telling me? What are the people on the ground in these jobs who are putting something at risk? What are their issues? And then you block and tackle. And sometimes it may not be related to the union. I mean, it
Mhm.
has to have a certain social cohesion. I mean, that's why are certain congregations in religion successful? Are they tuned in to what their community needs? Are they creating something of value people can't get somewhere else? Do you have people's back and do you hear them when they have grievance?
Mm, Thank you. I'm just thinking about worker-led movements in New Jersey. How would you say worker-led movements such as union drives or worker cooperatives shaped the broader labor landscape in New Jersey?
So one of the examples would be I would say like 32BJ SEIU building service workers. And I look at what they've done, and default, they're a big supporter, of course, of the radio station, and so I have to declare that. And one of the things, though, that I like about them is that they are in the community, and so, for instance, when we had that situation where ICE came into Newark, into that restaurant, and detained American citizens, a veteran, undocumented people and the mayor, Baraka, who was paying attention, immediately they had a press conference and filled the room with community groups, the diversity and mosaic that is Newark, 32BJ. Really, it's a community that loves itself, that was on display in all of its glorious manifestations. 32BJ was a spark plug of that because they're in deep, they're in the neighborhood, they're in the churches, they're in the mosques. They are of that community. They speak the language of that community. And similarly, when there was a challenge, for instance, um, the airport workers, this is a constituency where there work for subcontractors, sub minimum wage. 32BJ goes into these environments and it's not so focused on what are the workers going to give us, but can we raise the circumstance of the workers? Hector Ferrero was a great visionary leader of 32BJ. They had a big drive for $15 an hour. The unions that are fighting for the broader category of workers and fight for things like $15 an hour, not necessarily tied into getting membership, make themselves relevant in a broader conversation. Now, where it can come up short is when they are reliant only on one political party. And I'll give you a sad story. I told you a good story about mobilization. And certainly, for instance, Amazon wanted to come in Newark with a sweetheart deal, 32BJ, pushed back. They organized. There's many cases where there's land use decisions, environmental decisions, where because they have their eye out for the full human being. It's one thing if you get somebody a great job and help them get a great wage, but they go home to all kinds of smoke and environmental degradation. What good is it if their life is shortened, right? Their life is shortened. And so you have to stand up and be present in the totality of that. Now, a case that reflects forever negatively on Governor Murphy was a decision not to pay hazard pay to folks who were low wage essential workers. New Jersey there was a bill offered to provide a $1,000 payment to people that were below $60,000 that were security guards, that were people that kept society working. And the state of New Jersey, unlike other states that are civilized, refused to pay that money and instead bought an entire new fleet of armored SUVs. Instead, handed it out as patronage. And that was Democrats.
Thank you, Bob. Joy, I see your hand up, and I'm sorry I didn't see it before. I hope you didn't raise it before I jumped in with my question, but
No, I didn't. It's okay.
good.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this information. It's been very enlightening. I would love if you could elaborate a little bit more on the unions as human enterprises, right? Like, so the power dynamics, the racism, the sexism that may exist, and how you're seeing models to navigate these things, particularly like leadership models and intergenerational collaborations.
Right. And so right now there's a major where this is being playing out was 1199 SCIU, which is the largest healthcare union in the country, 450,000 members in, I think it's like west of the Mississippi, it's like 12, 13 states. And there is the regime, the incumbent is George Grisham, and he's being challenged by people that had come up that he had brought up who think he should move on. And so this conversation is happening right now. And it is and that's why we're having all the different candidates on our air, like the junior league, like League of Women Voters for unions, because so often what happens is there is not the opportunity, the even playing field for the challengers or for the people that are younger. And so to democratize unions, to make it be a reflection of our best aspiration, there has to be an even playing field. And the healthier unions, I would say unions that are supporting us, knowing we're going to put on the opposition, that's a good sign. One of the other challenges to think about is the organizing that happens within unions of the workers in the unions. So there's a whole other dynamic. SCIU 1199 just came through an event, I would say a traumatic event, where the News Guild is organizing the 600 workers of 1199 SCIU. Talk about living your values, right? All of a sudden, you find yourself as a union leader making sure that you're holding a union election so that your workers can have the same thing you're fighting for your members to have. So
Mm.
those are the battles that are going on. And you see, it's a challenge. There's no like set answer, but what needs to happen is transparency, also mentoring. I think it's very important for to have conversations about succession planning. It doesn't happen by itself. And you also need to be thinking as you're recruiting, and you need to create unions that are looking at skill development in members. One of
Mm.
the things that why I like what we're doing at WBAI is we often we'll have a union person on, and then we have union members who may not be ready to be a shop steward call in, develop that ability and that agency by communicating to a mass audience. Um, and then also one of the great things, this is one of the things about BI that I like in Pacific in general, is we provide a platform and then help people produce their own radio program. We had a situation happen where in New York City, the civil servants there, some of the unions decided they wanted to get some money to help get raises for their current workers, thought they would sell off the Medicare entitlement that their retired civil servants have. 250,000 retired civil servants, lunchroom attendants, engineers, firefighters, teachers, all had a promise when they came into employment as public employees, may have been the 60s, may have been the 70s, but it's a promise that they would never pay for health care. And so those people, as young people that could have gone into any number of fields, made a calculation. I'm going to work for less money, serve the public, and in my later years, in my twilight years, have secure health care. The city and politicians, rather than raise taxes on the wealthy, decided to realize what they said was $600 million by selling that privilege out every year. The retirees organized, 50,000 of them, raised $2 million. And I'm talking about lunchroom attendants, 40,000 New York City retirees live below poverty. It's important to stipulate that many of these job titles, particularly in service, most often held by people of color, those pensions and Social Security leave them in poverty today. They organized and they fought the city of New York and are winning in court. We gave those people a radio program. Even though it means that I work for DC 37, they're not happy. They don't like, but that's the thing. Like, we need platforms that build capacity, that uplift people, and give them a place to find their own voice.
Thank you.
I just want to jump in here, Maria, just to acknowledge a comment in the chat. The comment says, a large percentage of labor union members voted for Trump. Many embrace anti-science movements like MAHA. For instance, groups like Teachers for Choice successfully fought A, mandatory vaccines, B, mandatory use of N95s, and C, mandatory testing. However, Teachers for Choice fails to advocate for air purification. I believe that lack of care for public health makes them a fascist adjacent organization. How can anti-eugenic, anti-fascist, anti-racist abolitionists attract the union members who love 47 into a truly progressive, inclusive, anti-eugenic, poor people's campaign train? Allow me to add, many of the constituents who voted for Trump also voted for AOC. Thanks for the work.
So this is right to the heart of one of the most contentious issues about vaccination. And so one of the things that I have worked on as a reporter covering this space is to maintain conversation with all of the principals. Does that mean that I ascribe to them or that I believe in what they're saying? No, I believe they're human beings on God's earth. And as a communicator and a facilitator of a public conversation, I need to maintain civility and a conversation. I have a level of detailed knowledge about what happened in New York City that is probably, aside from maybe, I don't know who else has followed it as closely. The chief leader is the civil service paper. It's been covering the civil service since 1897. In that position, I was covering the TikTok of what happened there. There were two models that could have happened. The city of New York, under Mayor de Blasio, was asked by the Municipal Labor Committee to open up collective bargaining about the terms and conditions for vaccinating the population. It is objectively something to be concerned about, that you could be employed in a job for years and be told that you can only hold that job subsequent to a government mandated vaccination. Just as an objective principle, that's a heavy requirement. I'm not getting into right now, I will later on, about the efficacy of that. Sarah Nelson, who leads the AFA, as I said, flight attendants, had 75,000 flight attendants working for 20 carriers. Nobody was fired. Why? Because they used collective bargaining to address the issues that the primarily female workforce had. If you go back to that period, remember, there was not, because my daughters were of childbearing years and are, there was great debate within the medical community about the right course of action for women that were pregnant or for people that wanted to be pregnant. To say there was consensus just isn't reading the literature, because it was all over the place. Together, management and the union worked out a protocol so that people could address their concerns that were legitimate, and nobody was fired. In New York City, Mayor de Blasio did not do collective bargaining. He identified individual unions and would go on the Morning Joe show and get headlines by saying that he was doing this and requiring this from this union, and he wasn't going to negotiate with the unions because he had the best interest of the people of New York, whereas the unions were just concerned about their members. That was disingenuous, it was dishonest, and it was narcissistic. And so what resulted is the actual rollout of New York City's vaccination thing was all over the place. You had situations where the police department was given carte blanche, they were given exemptions, and so it really depended very much on which agency you were in. There was a wide divergence of the application of the religious exemption. In some cases, people actually did have contraindications, specifically in large heart issues, where they were denied. In other places, people with very flimsy counterindications were granted depending on their political connections and the status of the union. So I would say to you that the question about, and there's litigation about this, the question about the mandatory vaccination, particularly outside of healthcare, because I think a case has been established pretty well that people who are in healthcare, who are involved with care for an individual, that there is case law to support that you can be mandated to take it. I think that that's holding up in court. But in some of these other occupations, all I'm just saying to you is it's very nuanced, and we have to keep the conversation going. We just can't objectify people as being beyond the dignity of a conversation.
Yeah.
Cookie, I see that you've got your hand up.
So, hello, everyone. I am the Outreach Director for the Latino Action Network Foundation, and I just want to again applaud Gathering Ground for the creative way you are organizing. It's unusual to me, and I've been at this for a long, long time, and I'm completely impressed by this work. I know that you have a number of organizations here that do the one-on-one front line and all of that stuff, but you have a lot of organizations here that are also collectively unified with constituencies almost, or if there's another word for communities that we speak for, with, and to, and and all of that. So I'm struggling because from the first word in your meeting in Ewing, I loved you, right? But I'm trying to bring us together in creative ways that doesn't give us like more work, just to kind of like join on to this collective kind of voice and central messaging to things that I know 99.9% of us would be in favor of. And I don't know how to bring this kind of conversation or dialogue to our communities beyond those of us who don't have a radio station or
Mhm.
these kinds of platforms, because we are struggling, choking to death right now, as you can imagine, all of us. I don't think anybody's exempt from that. But and you have an army sitting right here. There's what, not even 20 of us here, but we can speak to larger audiences,
Mhm.
and I need to figure out how to mimic this or mirror this in a way that it can have the impact on New Jersey as it's having on me and maybe some of us here in this Zoom meeting itself.
I appreciate that so much, Cookie. That's a
Can
very
I
important
say
point.
something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, Bob.
You have a radio station. So so that's the model here. That's one of the reasons why this is such an important resource, right? Is that and Maria we are about getting what's going on here reflected on the air. And that's what makes it such a precious resource, is it's not commercially held. It's based on the community's well-being and what the community, as it defines itself, wants to do.
Thank you, Bob.
And just to remind everybody, when you registered, if you indicated that you were comfortable having your contact information shared with the attendees for today, that will happen. So you'll get an email from us that will have the emails and the names of folks who actually participated in the call today. So you can continue these connections after the fact.
Gathering ground, as it were.
Right.
Gathering ground, as it
Exactly.
were.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm looking at my list of questions that I've prepared for you, Bob, and I'm trying to think of what Cookie just said. Cookie, the spelling of I love your name, but the spelling threw me off, so I wasn't sure. That's why I'm glad Casey jumped in to help out with that.
It's the original Taino dialect of Puerto Rico spelling of cookie.
Love it. Thank you. I will never get that wrong again. So again, thanks Casey for jumping in because I hate mispronouncing people's names. I'm a big stickler for that. So, I'm just thinking, one of the messages, just to kind of follow up on Cookie's point, that we can bring to our community, not work, a lot of the people that we interact with, a lot of our partners are nonprofit workers and professionals. And labor organizing is not something you see a whole lot in the nonprofit sector, but organizing in general, and this is one of the reasons why, I truly believe that our economic realities, our workplaces, shape so much of our lives, right? We spend so much of our time in the workplace. And so in many ways, our work lives shape our lives outside of work as well. And so I think that the skills that you learn in labor organizing are important skills that can help grow this movement, can help, sort of create this coalition that fights back against the junta, as you call it, to really kind of bring about the kind of change that we want to see, not just in workplaces, but in our communities, in our state. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, who is doing labor organizing well, and what can we learn from those that are doing well to really sort of apply those skills to just the broader organizing ecosystem?
So, what I'm thinking of is I look at, and it's interesting to tell about the UAW story, for instance. And so, one of the problems is that the diminution of the labor movement that happened since Ronald Reagan did have some serious consequences. One of them was the corruption. We have to be honest and talk about a little bit the corruption that has been in and still is in the American labor movement, and it's in New Jersey. And so we can't get to higher ground until we account for the lower places in our own circumstance. And I'll give you an example of and how in reconciling this, our aspiration versus our reality is our transformation, right? The UAW, people not really, you see Sean Fain's name, right? And he's all over the place, right? Well, the Easter Bunny did not bring Sean Fain. He is a consequence of the fact that UAW, founded by Walter Reuther in the 1930s, United Auto Workers, was a giant in the labor movement. It really had Martin Luther King's back in a way that few unions did. It was on the right side of the Vietnam War, which few unions were. And something happened when Ronald Reagan did what he did to Patco, and when neoliberal and multinational policies started driving decisions made by both parties. And manufacturing was deconstructed as a policy. American taxation actually supported and facilitated the exportation of its industrial base to other countries. And so the UAW fell on hard times. The UAW was based on a delegate system. It wasn't direct democracy. And it got so bad that there was a massive criminal trial where 2 busloads of UAW top officials, including 2 former presidents, were convicted and sent to a federal penitentiary. They basically sold out the entirety of the workforce for a few $1,000,000. As a result of that, a special master was appointed by the Department of Justice, and the first direct election in the history of the UAW occurred, and that produced Sean Fain. It took 10 years of grassroots reform work for them to be able to get new leadership. And now, when I look at what they're doing, organizing, for instance, where I think you see in around the United States, but here in this region, they're organizing retailers, booksellers. You see, for instance, what's happening with the Rutgers. It's not UAW, but the Rutgers unions that are organizing around the research assistants, people who work on college campuses. These are real bright spots. These are young people willing to put something at risk to collectively organize. Um, and it's the UAW, for instance, organized Columbia, and you will see, and this is something I'm glad you referenced because about who's doing it well. Of course, Columbia now has fired the UAW president of that local that's organized those graduate students. And so what you're seeing is the places where they've been most effective are the places now that are getting such pushback. I would say certainly Unite has done a good job, RWDSU. Um, but these are, I mean, it's really tough. I mean, one of the things though that is favoring this is a moment. 45 million people after the pandemic changed their jobs. They called it the Great Resignation, and the attitude people have about work has changed. And one of the other things that we have working for us now is in the 1981 when Reagan fired all air traffic controllers, over 60% of the American population approved what he did, had a negative view of unions. Today, we know from the Gallup poll, the highest percentage in history, 70% support the goals of unionization. And that is a direct consequence of the unprecedented concentration of wealth that we've seen that is now beyond what existed during the Gilded Age.
That is certainly, we something that we have been seeing so much with Amazon, the Amazon Labor Union. We had
Right.
Chris Smalls here a few weeks ago talking about the efforts and how they really kind of stemmed from safety or unsafe working conditions in the Amazon warehouse, and how it led to organizing and creating the Amazon Labor Union that's been fighting an uphill battle against such a giant like Bezos. I had a question and now I just lost it. Oh my gosh.
I
Forgive
have
me,
one
folks.
if you want,
Great,
if you
thank
want to come
you.
back to it.
Yes.
And again, just for anyone who wants to ask questions, feel free to use the raise your hand function or drop something in the chat to us as well. Bob, I'm kind of curious as you think about modern workplace safety concerns, especially things like gig work, right?
Mhm.
Which is a huge sector. It's growing in part because it can be really hard to stay in employee, in large corporations and employers. Warehouses like Amazon, can you compare the conditions that led to where we're at now, how gig workers are affected, the ways in which, folks might be able to organize when they don't have an employer structure to work within?
Right. So I would say, of course, it's ironic that, of course, yesterday or this week was the anniversary of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And that's for folks who don't know, when 146 mostly young immigrant women perished in Lower Manhattan. It was about a block east of Washington Square Park. It's in a building now that the NYU owns. And so that was a consequence of, and it's worth telling, in 1909, 20,000, primarily young immigrant Jewish and Italian women, some men, organized a general strike in Lower Manhattan and brought an industry to its knees, and resulting in a breakthrough contract that recognized their union and raised their wages. And as it turned out, the building owners at this building that had the terrible fire were really resistant to the union, and so that's why they locked the doors and windows, because they were worried that organizers would come in and work with their workforce. And so, as a consequence of that fire and the fact that these women, many of them had to jump out the window to their death, several stories, galvanized the world. It became a focal point. And so, um, so that's one. And then, of course, we had, and this is in my book, Stagnation, which Maria was so helpful with in a prior incarnation, helping me publish. Um, then we scroll forward to what happened on 9/11, right? Let's think about that. We don't often put that in terms of occupational health, but it is perhaps one of the largest occupational health disasters, aside from mining, because we had tens of thousands of first responders and employees of all kinds in Lower Manhattan after the attack and the collapse of the buildings and the fires that burned on for several months. We're told by the United States government and the form of our former governor, Christy Todd Whitman, that the air was safe to breathe. We know now from an inspector general report in 2003 that the EPA lied and that it suppressed information about how deadly the air actually was. I would just say to you that Inspector General was exactly the post that Donald Trump eliminated. So if people have any idea of like what do inspector generals do, inspector generals in that case documented that the EPA lied. Why? Because they wanted to keep Wall Street open. And so today, more people have died from 9/11 afflictions than died the day of the attack. 343 firefighters died in the collapse. Around 380 have died of occupational diseases. Many more thousands are terminally ill with cancer as a consequence of the misrepresentation and actual lying by the United States government. I raise that only to talk about the broad topic of where we are with occupational health. Now, you would say that's not making progress. Certainly, 146 perished at the Triangle Fire. Ironically, for trivia buffs, there was a fire in Newark just a few months earlier where 40 women perished under the same kinds of circumstances, by the way. All I'm saying is that what happened in this was that unions organized, and that's why there's a 9/11 World Trade Center Health Fund. That's why there's a victim compensation fund. And even people that were undocumented are seeing some benefit, although it's very hard for them to access the system. So this idea of you talk about the challenge of gig work, right? And so I think the idea here is it's possible for individuals who are in a gig economy to organize. I'll give you a good example. The Taxi Workers Alliance. New York City has, you may remember, had yellow cab medallions. These were the privilege and franchise to operate a cab in New York City that the city of New York sold. Like these weren't free. And you could pay $600,000, $1 million. And then many immigrant households bought these licenses with the expectation that the city would protect the value of them. The city instead brought in Uber and Lyft and let the price go down. The Taxi Workers Alliance organized the Uber and Lyft drivers. And they just had a $350 million settlement for back wages. So there is power in recognition of your common misery. And so that's why I would say you could build consciousness among anybody that is similarly afflicted, and you have to be willing to put something at risk and to realize that you can do better when you work together with other people. And I would often say that, I mean, one of the things I notice is that people need to, like when you're going to take on a gig job, try to find out if anybody else, if you can talk to anybody else who's doing it.
Yeah.
Like that's another thing. Like people were, I mean, I don't know if that's responsive. You want to know like what people can do if they're in a gig situation?
No, I think that's helpful for, for what I was aiming for. Thanks,
Okay.
Bob.
We have a question in the chat. Bob, I'm going to ask it, and we have about 3 minutes before we should turn off the recording. So I'm going to ask the question, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone else. I did remember my question, so if I have a chance, I'll ask it, but I want to give precedence to all of you. So the question is, any guidance on how to organize an unaffiliated group like unpaid family caregivers? There are 53 million nationwide and 1 million in New Jersey. Many of us are working part-time or full-time while also caring for aging family members. The HHS cuts hit directly at the agencies that provide affordable care services we are relying on. How can we collectively organize and demand these services and funding? Can we align with the healthcare unions? Great question.
Yes. And so also I want to make sure, because this is a great segment to put on the radio, because it's I'm sorry, I'm always looking for, that's what I do.
Content.
Because and also that's a way of you finding other people, because the key is we're not alone. And I mean, one of the things, I will suggest that you also look at a site called Work Bites that I write for, which is a collective of labor writers committed to the union movement. and critical of the union movement. And this right now, there's a big debate in New York City. There's a group of workers who actually are forced to live with the person they care for, but only get paid for 12 hours a day. It's a form of modern day slavery. They're actually in the home and are responsible in the event that something happened to the one person they're caring for, but they're only paid for 12 hours. What you're talking about is the larger population of people that are the sandwich generation or are caring for an elderly parent. And I would suggest that the effective level to start with is at your community and the county level. Make yourself known or seek out the local senior center in your community. There's quite an architect, there's quite an infrastructure of them. Um, every like as a grassroots organizer, those are natural havens for a conversation. People got time on their hands. So when you go to a senior center at the municipal level or county level, you begin to have those conversations and develop support networks and even suggest, let's have a forum on this issue. How can we advance it? And then to hold um, both, and this work has to start now, quite frankly, because local, county, and state governments are going to be feeling in this next budget cycle the junta's attempt to break up public health and the social safety net right now. So I would suggest that you take time and go. I know you're busy, but find out where your local senior citizen center is and don't struggle in isolation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mary, for asking that question. Okay, my question was, and I don't know if you can answer this, Bob. Oh, actually, Josie has a question, so I'll let Josie go first. Is that right, Josie? Did I say your name correctly?
Yeah, it's Josie.
Great.
Hello, Bob.
Like,
We still want to do that radio show on WBAI at Public Square. I know we're coming to the end, and I didn't want to leave without saying we've been planning a labor forum this May for May Day, and would love to sort of work with folks who reached out to a couple of unions. We about a couple of years ago, and is Cookie still here? Cookie was one of the panelists. We did a forum with union folks and organizers, including Poor People's Campaign, sponsored by the People's Organization for Progress. And so one of
Larry
the
Hand.
Yes, and Larry, it was quite a feat to moderate Larry Ham. At the core of this, our concerns are around the growing, and back then this was 2 years ago when we did it, the growing precarious economy and ways in which folks are organizing in that precarity. And it is now compounded by sort of the new sort of economic sort of policies that are coming down. And so I'm talking about whole en masse tariffs and layoffs and all of these things. So we've been moving into an acceptable precarious economy with in post 2008, we've seen gig workers sort of become fashionable, and we've seen essential workers without benefits, without healthcare protections, et cetera. And so what I'm interested in, what we're interested in at Public Square Amplified, and we're a news organization, we're interested in reporting on working class issues and ways in which working class people are organizing in coalitions with students, with activists, with retirees, with the unemployed. We're really interested in those stories. And so this panel is how to sort of look at how are we building coalitions around economic justice, because it is through, in a capitalist economy, it's through fighting for economic justice that we get to human rights and we get to a whole variety of things. So I'd like to encourage folks who are interested in that to reach out to us. Gathering Ground would love to collaborate with you. Our funder is here, and I'm so happy to see Allende here. We're always looking to do this work in coalition and collaboration. So please, Bob, Maria, and others, let's try to do more of these forums around labor. We don't spend enough time talking about labor. So we talk a lot about social justice, and at the core of social justice is labor, right? You make transformations through paying people equitably, paying people what they're worth. My father was a civil servant. He was an agriculturist. He was a scientist on my island. And whenever unions would go on strike, my father would go on strike. And as children, we would have to walk the picket line with our father. That's just what he did. And we understood that workers were at the center of a family and center of civil society. And so when Bob talks about the collapse in social contract, it is because workers have now become these precarious, commodified things that we no longer see the humanity in. So I'd love for us to figure out how we do more of these labor forums and talk more about it, because I don't think because we've gutted public education, we've gutted the labor force. Those who are on the front lines of fighting for racial and social justice are not grounded in labor history, labor politics, and labor laws. And so when the National Labor Relations Board gets gutted and laws change, there is no connection to that for social and racial justice. So I'm hoping folks would reach out to me, would love to do a piece this May. Of course, it's, May Day. We wanted to do it around May Day, so we'd love to. It's also, 100 days after the current administration. I'm also an immigrant, and so, immigrant rights and labor rights are so important to immigrants, and ways in which we show up in unions and ways in which we negotiate our path through unions for justice. So really terrific conversation, and please reach out. And Maria, I hope we get to chat and collaborate maybe on this. Would love to. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. I mean, I completely agree. That's the reason why we had our briefing with Chris Smalls on his work with the Amazon Labor Union, and we have Bob here today, because I completely agree. I think, economic realities and providing people a living wage that allows for standards of living to be equitable for all, I believe, are at the basis of human society. And so thank you, Josie, for your comments. I would love to talk more with you about this. And I think we should stop the recording at this point, or should I ask the question, Casey?
Yeah, I'm curious, if folks have questions that they want to ask, maybe just drop me a +1 in the chat to let me know, and we can stop the recording. If not, then we can keep it going. Just so
I
that
did want to
everyone...
respond, because that was just a
Oh,
great.
yes.
I wanted to say that it's so important. This idea of labor history is not taught, and it is something that we do need to develop teach-ins around, because the things we take for granted as people that are somewhat familiar with it, people do not understand the power of collective action. And so that robbing people of that sense of agency is the core. And so I think that we have an opportunity now. It's also important to reflect on why the Democratic Party fell so flat. I've done a lot of work. We had a cycle of programs with Reverend Barber called Monday, the Labor Radio Hour, with Bob Hennelly and Reverend Barber. And what I did was I put him in studio in conversation with EMTs, with different people of different workforces, circumstances, so that there could be this conversation that was unscripted about the struggle that they're facing. And in that struggle, and in that collective recognition of that struggle, is tremendous power. And so we have to facilitate those conversations. One of the reasons why people got turned off in this last election was that the Democratic Party and the apparatus coming out of Washington would pull out charts that showed a stock market gaining in value, aggregate employment numbers that showed full employment, wages in the margins that went up 0.10%. Nobody lives in the aggregate. People struggle in isolation. And so what was actually happening was the continuing flatlining. And I'll tell you something that I've used is the United Way's ALICE indicator, asset limited, income constrained, but employed. Very important matrix. Developed by Dr. Stephanie Hoops, started in New Jersey and is now extended to like 18 states. looks by zip code at the actual cost of living, factoring in the healthcare, childcare, utilities. And what you'll find is I predicted AOC would win because I pulled those numbers for the places where Crowley had been an incumbent for so long. And during his tenure in that area of Bronx and Queens, a majority of households were either living in poverty or struggling week to week to get by. In the state of New Jersey, in Cumberland County, we have zip codes in Essex County where over half the population is struggling to get by week to week. If you get those people talking among themselves, you have the power of transformation.
I will do a shameless plug now, since you're talking about the importance of getting people talk to one another. We are, I think Casey put it in the chat, we are hosting a gathering on April 7th at the College of New Jersey, where Cookie was with us on day one. This is day two, which was a rescheduled date. We would love to have you join us for a continuation of this and other conversations that are so important to really bringing about the kind of change we want to see. We have about 10 minutes. Are there any other questions that were put in the chat, Casey? Nope.
As of right now, no. So we've got about another 5 to 6 minutes of conversation, and then we'll kind of close out for the day.
Oh no, Cookie, I just saw your message.
Sorry, we'll keep you looped in on the other side.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to ask the question that escaped me before. I was trying to make the point that we're seeing such an interest in labor organizing and unionization with the Amazon Labor Union, Starbucks, and other efforts across the country. But unions are just one response to kind of gain some control over our economic lives, over our workplaces, and negotiate with employers ways to get some of the benefits or some of the wages increases and working conditions that really make their work life more manageable, more will benefit them better. But that's only one option. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about an alternative way of organizing workplaces, which is more, instead of a hierarchical structure, more horizontal structure, which we see in worker co-ops. Is there anything that you can share with us about?
So I would say that I don't really have. I work with our landlord at 388 Atlantic Avenue is Seeds Us, which is a kind of collective which does alternative financing that helps. For instance, you're familiar with the Michael Moore film Capitalism Love Story. There was a story of workers who found themselves with a plant that made windows and doors, and the manufacturer wanted to go to Mexico and they wanted to buy the plant. And this collective we work with, it's our landlord that we like working with, help facilitate the financial transaction so the workers could buy that facility. I would tell you that I think that for me, what is effective is local residential organizing, neighborhood organizing, because that is you have the premise of the shared space, the shared community that your encounter at the grocery store, your encounter in every interaction is an opportunity to be in community and to learn from other people. And particularly, like I would say, we're involved with Trinity Church here in Asbury Park, which I guess we've had 90 people in shelter in the Code Blue place for several weeks. I think just finally, with the cold snap, kind of broke off. It was a cold, late winter, early spring. But I would say building community around local conditions would be most effective because everybody lives somewhere. And if they don't, you can find out why.
Thank you.
And may I add to that, Bob? If you're doing that, then you should bring in your local news organization. I mean, that's the purpose for them being there. You should collaborate with them. Have
If
them
they
search
exist.
together.
I mean, that's a whole other, we do need to have a conversation
Yeah,
about
exactly. Yeah.
right. Because when I started with the Ramsey Mauer Reporter at 17, which is a half century ago, there were 4 other adults who had driver's licenses whose job it was to cover Board of Educations. That whole architecture is gone. So there isn't anybody. I used to go from police station to police station asking to see the police log. Now it's very random, and we have an information system. And this is, I mean, gathering ground. You should, far be it from me to suggest a topic, but the collapse of authenticated news and information. How do we know what we know?
Mm-hmm.
Is now become a civil defense imperative. I mean, this is no joke that we have a country where I was, amazingly enough, I made it into the jury box recently in Avoidere in Monmouth County for a capital murder case. They eventually knocked me out when they asked what I did for a living. But I made it through lunchtime being seated and paneled in the jury. And when they asked everyone of the 200 people I sat through the process of Avoidere, where do you get information from? Less than 5% mentioned a newspaper. Every single person either talked about X or social media on their phone. So, can we be surprised that we can't agree on who won the last election or even how to deal with a pandemic?
Right. Yeah.
And I just
Ayanda.
want to, yeah, good. Ayanda, go ahead. Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry
okay.
I'm on. So I'm sorry I'm off camera. I'm going to go, but just to plug in local news, Josie's one of our dynamic, just go-getter grantees, and what she's doing at Public Square Amplify is just out of this world. You should just see the young people in her program who are just the next world leaders and hopefully the president of everything, right? But local news does exist. It is under attack, but local news is very important. What we say here at the consortium, if local news isn't your first priority, it should be your second, right? Because local news is the vehicle in which people get information, are informed, and to be able to make informed decisions, they need local news. And I think where we're at in this context is we have to be open at local news looking differently. We find platforms that are solely on social media. A lot of people don't get their newspaper anymore. When I grew up, my dad every Saturday went to Cherry Hill Diner and got the Carrier Post. He gave me the funny section and we sat and read for a few hours. That's no longer the reality for many people, right? So I think it's also figuring out how to show up in different spaces differently for those people, right? So if you're in Salem County, it may be something like a physical newsletter that goes door to door. If you are someone like Josie and her platform, it may be a newsletter or Instagram, or also just community meetings, and gathering people and telling the stories that are happening in their community. So yes, local news exists. It is under attack, and it's very pertinent in the movement because historically, marginalized people had to take charge of their own news and information to get where they were going.
Thank you so much, Ayanda. Okay, we are almost at time.
I would say the one thing I would say is that what's happened though with the consolidation of news, just in terms of content, and what's happened to being able to make a living as a journalist, that has been turned into something wholly different. At the Village Voice in the 1990s, I would make $1 a word. Today at Salon, I receive a nickel. The starting salary as SAG-AFTRA radio position for Pacifica was $48,000 in 1999. It's $45,000 now. So while all this is true that these local things are happening, in terms of the regulated spaces, let's remember the airways belong to the public. Deregulation process turned it into property rights for Rupert Murdoch. And so while all these individual things exist, if you look, we do have news deserts in large swaths parts of the country. One of the things we're doing at the Pacifica Network with 210 stations in 40 states is giving amplification. The broadcast thing belongs to the public, and it has been taken over by these corporations that have consolidated and closed local news departments. It's become actually a civil defense issue. In the Western North Carolina, when Helene hit, there were automated engineers and AI were driving many of those local radio stations. So people did not even have real-time information about the weather.
Yeah. We have 1 minute left, and we usually like to designate a few minutes just to kind of get some of you to share your feedback, your aha moments with us. We have, like I said, about 60 seconds. So if anyone wants to share anything any responses that they have to today's briefing, we would love to hear from you. We are putting ways to reach Bob in the chat. We have some links to share with you all, along with our own ways to connect with Gathering Ground on social media. We ask that you check out our program calendar for all the exciting programming we have, starting with April 1 and 2 and our racial equity training series. Anyone have anything they want to share? No? Okay, then it's 4 o'clock. Thank you so much for being
Thanks
here.
so
It
much.
sounds like this
Right.
is a conversation that was super important and very interesting to all of you. So we hope to do more of these. And thank you for showing up and making time to be with us today. And thank you, Bob, of course, for making the time to be with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Support BAI.